Wonderful. Well, we'll open up for questions and discussion. Yes, I think Anna Mastrioni.
Thank you. I had a question about the University of Washington program, the HSP. My question concerns how, I know there haven't been very many claims, but how, in theory, would the policy address injury to a child or a fetal injury, when a pregnant or lactating person is included in a clinical trial? Do you have any insight on that?
I don't think it would be handled any differently than any other claim. I'm not even aware if we've even had one. As I said, there's been so few. But the first step would be the identification that there has been a research-related illness or injury, and so that might come initially, from the patient expressing something that's going wrong, or it could be the research physician that's treating or overseeing that, or even their own maybe primary provider who's not associated with the research. So usually there's some sort of conversation within that group that's identifying that there's a problem and that additional care is going to be necessary in order to treat that issue. And then in our experience, it's usually the researcher who reaches out to our office to make us aware of the issue. Now, one of the challenges is sort of location, and I think that's an area where maybe our program hasn't addressed that gap fully. If you're having all of this research done, in our region where you have access to our medical facilities, then it's fairly simple. We submit that claim over to our clinical risk management office. They're working with our UW Medicine billing to flag that patient and the care costs activities that are associated with treatment and writing those off. If that's not happening though in our area, then it's through this other compensation program, which has a much more limited amount.
And it seems to me that there's almost a catch-22 in that when you're making those determinations about causation, you need the data to support that to even get it on a table if you're talking about the VICP. And here we have, in our area, there's very little data to even support that claim. So to me, it seems like a classic catch-22, the dearth of data. Yes.
And I don't know what because the ultimate decision is made by our clinical risk services office. So I don't know how they come to a final decision. At least in our office, in processing that initial inquiry, we're really relying on the investigator's judgment. If the investigator, in their opinion, feels like the issue is more likely than not caused by the participation in research, we rely on that assessment. So I would say we tend to lean in favor of their opinion rather than really, scrutinizing or putting the burden on the participant to sort of prove that case. I suspect, although I don't really know, that clinical risk services is also relying on the assessment of the investigator.
Yeah, if I could address that. The HPV vaccine is a perfect example. When the vaccine program was first created, every vaccine on there had real substantial associated injuries, not just anaphylaxis, which is what we have now basically in CERVA. The HPV vaccine went on the table with no associated injuries, and people's statutes of limitations, because it was 3 years from the onset of symptoms, were running before the post-release surveillance studies were even released. If you have a non-table case in the vaccine program, there's a lot of case law about this, but you have to have literature. They're going to say you're not required to have literature, but that is not really true. If you don't have literature, you don't have sound and reliable scientific or medical explanation for your causation. And that becomes a significant issue, which is how initially a huge swath of these cases were dismissed. And then what happens is, because it's a small program, the same 8 special masters, it's, oh, I've seen that, those are not cases. And then people stop bringing them because while our attorney's fees are paid by the program, and theoretically you get attorney's fees win or lose, designed to get a sophisticated and accomplished bar to represent these people, that's not true. If you don't have a reasonable basis to file And the court is now interpreting reasonable basis is if all of these cases have lost in the past, then you're not going to have reasonable basis and we're going to kick you out fast and not pay your attorney or your experts for anything that you do. That has a dramatic chilling effect, and which is why some of these cases are now opting out. In the past, the HPV cases initially started to opt out after they went through the entire process, trial, decision, appeal, loss, then they opted out. Now they're hitting the 240-day mark, which is what's allowed into the statute. They put everything in, and they're opting out. And I can't really blame them because if you know you've got zero chance in the program, why not take a chance out? And I will say, GW hosted a genetics evidence in the law conference a few years ago, and we went to some colleagues of mine, and there were some big defense counsel for toxic tort cases and the big products liability cases, and they were talking about the use of this very complex science in cases, and they started to read, they're like, but some courts get it. And they started to read this one case, and my colleague who was in from Florida said, oh my God, that's my case. And it was a vaccine case. So our very informal, petitioner-friendly, generous, easy program, we're doing some very sophisticated litigation with incredibly complex science. So you're absolutely right. If it's put on the table without that, you're going to lose quick and dirty in our program. And we, at one point, when the HPV or the Hep B vaccine was added, it was the first one to really be added without any associated injuries. And the special masters gave us a stay, a scientific stay. That lasted for many years. They're not doing that anymore. They can't, the court's overwhelmed. So they can't do that. We're not allowed to develop the science. We have to just go. And that means you lose, unfortunately.
Bruce Schoolett?
Thanks, Cece, and thanks to all the participants. I'm learning a lot through this panel. Thank you very much. I've got a particular question for Professors Parasitas and Professor Mello. We've heard that one of the potential liability disincentives to research in these populations is liability once the drugs are actually marketed and being used by these populations in commercial use. And I'm wondering whether your observations about the tort law and potential compensation systems can be adapted or applied, or how they would be applied in the context of marketed products for the pregnant and lactating populations. Thank you.
Well, I'm sure Efthymi will have some things to say about that. I think, all of the same difficulties confront a plaintiff once they're in the after-marketing situation. The distinction that might make it slightly easier is just that there are a lot more of them out there. And if there are groups of plaintiffs that have similar injuries, then aggregate litigation, either MDL or class action, becomes at least a theoretical possibility that helps overcome problems like your damages just aren't big enough to get into tort. But make no mistake, especially for a new drug where there isn't substantial experience yet accumulated to show causation, those kinds of plaintiffs still face a steep uphill climb in tort.
I agree 100% with Michelle. I think it's a great question. Part of the challenge, too, for plaintiffs is finding a lawyer to take the case if the damages are so uncertain. I mean, the lawyers are going to budget in expert fees, their time, expenses, et cetera. And some studies have shown that if the anticipated amount is less than 250 or even 500,000 for the case, the lawyers won't even take on. So unless you're pretty confident you're going to have a mass tort or a class action or some MDL, I don't think the lawyers would even be willing to take on these cases. So a lot of them just end up going uncompensated, unlitigated. That's a part, I think, the last thing I think is relevant too is it's apart from the question of causation and also apart from the question of to what extent did the FDA's label disclose the relevant risks that would therefore might preempt some type of tort claims as well. So I think there's a lot there that would, again, I think tort law is just be very, very tricky for to navigate.
Thank you. I think next we have Efengwa Asudu.
Hi, thank you to all of the panelists. I have 3 sets of questions for different speakers, so I'll do my best to get through them pretty quickly. The first are to Professor Mello and Parsis. I'm trying to find your name. where are you there? Parasitis. I think both of you raised really important equity questions and issues, especially as it pertains to taking the onus and the burden off of the research participants and back on the research institutions themselves. I'm curious about your thoughts regarding and knowing that not all research institutions are created equally, right? We have significant inequities and disparities as it pertains to the funding and endowments related to our HBCUs, our historically Black colleges and universities, in addition to our Hispanic serving institutions. Knowing that these institutions may also have greater access in a more diverse clinical trial study participants. So I'm just curious your thoughts about what are some potential unintended consequences that could impact those institutions and the researchers there, their ability to engage in this type of research, and would we unfortunately be perpetuating inequities in regard to who can conduct this type of research ethically and with not only ethically, but with an equitable lens and framework in mind? And are we only then continuing to perpetuate that this type of research is only conducted in certain types of institutions?
Yeah, it's such an important question. I think my answer is that, it is potentially a problem. And like any good hospital administrator, I would be thinking like, how can I shift these costs? So there are two possibilities there that I can think of. One is that we would eventually get to a place where those extra costs would be negotiated as part of the indirect cost rate for the trial sponsor to pay through the granting mechanism, at least for extramurally funded research. And the other is that, depending on the nature of the injury, it's not clear to me that it would be the institution that would have to bear all of the costs as opposed to the sponsor. For example, if the participant's injury seems to be related to the investigational product itself, as opposed to, it's a negligent informed consent claim, or somebody at the university didn't, monitor their symptoms appropriately. That's sponsor liability. That's not institutional liability. And so we might think about a scheme that has a process in it for apportioning out who bears the liability cost depending on the nature of the injury.
I think that's a fabulous question. And again, I agree with Michelle. One thing that came to mind is actually something that she had brought up in her talk about trying to think about balancing the cost between and among the federal government and institutional private insurance companies. So if there is this idea that the funder, right, so let's say it's a medical device company or pharmaceutical company, there could be some rule or regulation that requires them to have the minimum amount of insurance for compensation, whereas the NIH or some other federal funder would have their own program built in through the government. Again, I don't know if that's going to eliminate this, the rich get richer scenario when it comes to what's going to be the actual cost necessary to do the research. But I think it's something that in thinking about how to structure who pays, that's one of the factors, right? Will this funding mechanism result in the rich getting richer and have a disproportionate impact on colleges and universities with less research funding? And if so, how can we add funding, address that concern, mitigate it, et cetera?
Thank you. My second question are to our research participants, Dr. Schmid and Ms. Brown. Thank you both for being here and sharing your experiences. I'm just curious in terms of, it sounds like both of you had positive experiences. I'm curious if there could have been any other, I'm curious in terms of, would there have been any situations or scenarios that would have made it more challenging or difficult for you to be able to have participated in the research studies or projects that you did participate in addition to the ongoing follow-up?
I'll be happy to start. I mentioned a couple of them, just honestly, being able to attend the appointments, the flexibility of my job. I do have a nice white collar IT job where I was able to actually work during my infusions from the hospital. So I didn't have to take off all the extra time. I had reliable childcare for my older child. Just things about being able to show up and do that and be able to make it happen. Had my job not been as flexible and childcare not been as great, there would have been no way for me to participate in it. That's the first thing that comes to mind.
I guess I will start by saying I think that the overrepresentation of folks in the trial that I participated in was an RSV trial, and as a healthcare worker, I really wanted into the trial as it was in the middle of COVID. Nobody knew how COVID was going to happen and how our RSV was going to happen. So I would say the RSV trial for me was set up really to overrepresent individuals like me, healthcare workers, because it was at my place of employment, and I placed a lot of value on, I was crossing my fingers that I was getting the active vaccine, because I was hoping that it would give me protection in the middle of COVID. I think, to Ms. Brown's point, I think, had it not been at my place of work, I wouldn't have been able to participate. I couldn't have gone to another location to be able to participate, and the follow-up was really easy for me. But I think from I think the comment that you made about an equitable lens and being able to recruit participants from all walks of life. This trial did not do that well enough because it was really very heavily overrepresented by people who were pregnant healthcare workers in that institution were by far and away the most likely participants. And so I think that there's a lot of work to be done to really stretch and make trials like this available to participants who are not part of the healthcare facility. Thank you.
Thank you both. And then lastly, to Mr. Malone, in terms of the program at UW, I'm just curious in terms of what strategies and practices do you all currently have in place to help mitigate inequitable access and lack of awareness to your program for potential study participants? Because you had shared having a lower number of actual claims, but I'm also curious if you're seeing any inequities and disparities in who actually is able to put forth a claim.
Excellent question. I don't know if I have a solid answer, in part just because I don't have access to the data around the individual patients and the different types of demographic information that might indicate that. But I would say probably poor because of just the small number of claims that we have overall. And I think sort of moving a little bit further upstream, I think, and slightly off topic to today, so I'll just briefly comment on this. I think just there's a challenge for us, at least at our institution, about just diversity in general from different groups participating in research at our institution. And so you're already sort of starting, I think, some of our participant representatives here talked about this too, in terms of just sort of this natural self-selection of a much smaller group that is maybe necessarily representative of the overall population. And so you're already starting with that. And from there, then those are the only people who are hearing about the access to the program.
Can I pose a question that dovetails off of if anyone's, or is our time up? I'm not trying to jump the queue. It's just a little added on to that piece.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, the question really that I had had to do with, because I'm doing sort of leading health equity efforts, and a lot of that sort of the cornerstone there is oftentimes disaggregating data based on sort of demographic characteristics. And I'm curious, I guess twofold. One, I was thinking about it with regards to the University of Washington, their program, whether or not like demographic data are kind of captured and whether or not, and whether the claims sort of filing patterns or trends are actually looked at through that lens, which I think relates to what Ifenwa was presenting or asking. But then I was also thinking about it with regards to Michelle in your comments, who's done a lot of work around sort of tort kind of claims, and you were commenting on the amount of study and data that's available in that space. But I didn't know whether or not those types of demographic characteristics are available when looking at those types of analyses to start to sort of get a greater sense about sort of equitable kind of access, awarding, et cetera, even though you've already noted some of the inherent and sort of systemic inequities that are built into the strategies that we utilize to assess value. But I was just wondering whether those data are available for disaggregated and stratified analyses.
Yeah, Bronson, Tom Gallagher, who you know, and I have actually been looking into this recently, and we've really been shocked to learn that institutions don't record race, ethnicity as a matter of course in their claims system. Obviously, it exists in the hospital's clinical record, but as you know, pulling all that stuff together, super hard. Gender is usually coded, and if it's not coded, it's readily available from narratives that insurers keep about the injuries that happen. But yeah, for that reason, we don't really have good information about race and ethnicity as drivers of inequitable awards in the medical malpractice system, the way that we do for gender and age.
Great, thank you. Alexander Capron?
I have one question for Jason and one for Michelle. You said that, I think, Jason, you were somewhat surprised given the large number of participants in research at the University of Washington that you had such a low rate of claims. Have you ever studied whether that is because participants' health insurance covers the costs of many of the kinds of things that your program might otherwise pay for? And have you had any cases, I suppose, where someone came to you and said, well, I'm only here because my health insurance said this is a research-related injury and we don't cover that? I just wondered, is this something that you've looked at, given your surprise at the low number?
The short answer is no. I was invited here, but sort of with a little, not enough time to reach out to our clinical risk services group, who would actually have maybe some of that data. But I doubt that they have probably looked at that either. But if I were to make a guess, I would probably say yes. Many people are probably having their injuries covered through their insurance or other sorts of care, and so so the number of situations that maybe are not covered by those things, and they're aware of the program, and somebody makes a claim, now you're really kind of getting far out there, and that might be why we're seeing so few.
If you want to ask your clinical management group and get back to us, I would appreciate it, since the University of Washington is well known for having one of the longest standing programs of non-fault compensation for research injuries. The question for Michelle is, I'm not sure I fully understood what your reasoning was on 2 points. The first one is about the causation issues, and you made such a good description of the difficulties that people face in the tort system. Where do you come out on all the other virtues that a non-fault system could have in terms of equity and speed and so forth, on dealing with the causation question, particularly in research? The injuries may be novel. and there isn't experience. If they were obvious risks, they would have been listed on the consent form and so forth. But it's the things that you don't know to look for that are difficult. So help me with how you think the compensation system is advantageous there.
Yeah, I think my sense of that is that it's not going to be that different in administrative compensation system for injured participants. As I said, at least with the VICP, you have the benefit of long experience having accumulated, which can generate decisions that certain events are presumptively compensable, these tables that Renee has talked to us about. That's really not going to be easy to do for research participants for the reasons that you've outlined. So, I don't think you get around those issues in an administrative compensation system unless it's like so no fault that the rule is anybody in the trial who had something unexpected happen in their care get money. You could say they don't have to show causation. That would be a different kind of no-fault system.
Yeah. And the second thing is, I want to make sure I understood correctly. You were saying it's with the operating in the shadow of the tort system, which defendants as well as plaintiffs suffer with for all the reasons you described. Institutions could all develop their own compensation programs. And we heard already in the last couple of comments some of the difficulties that many institutions would face in doing that. But why is that better than a federal program? Is it just that for the reasons that Renee said, federal programs can be difficult to adapt to changing circumstances? Or is there another reason why it's better to have this spread out under individual institutions?
Yeah, so it's not more equitable, that's for sure. It would lead to a patchwork, and I know that is the focus of this panel today, so that's a really relevant consideration. It would likely lead to a lot of different solutions at different levels of generosity. I do think there are advantages to staying away from government control of the system. Certainly from the litigant's perspective, there's likely to be deeper insurance coverage than there would be coverage of injuries in a government-run no-fault compensation system. Again, you can insure yourself for however deep coverage you would like, but it needn't be limited to only compensating for out-of-pocket expenses, for example. And just the flexibility that institutions would have to modify their scheme and their staffing levels as needed. Pretty much all the problems that we heard Renee talk about are just easier to grapple with at the local level with local control. So those would be kind of the pros and cons.
Thank you.
Great. Mary Hebert?
I wanted to thank the speakers for their insight on these topics. I was curious about a couple of comments that were made, one being related to it's difficult to get an attorney to take a case, and the second related to the attorneys learning by failed previous cases to not put forward additional cases. What is your explanation for what happened with Bendectin, a product that didn't cause birth defects, that there were so many lawsuits against the drug company that